Hello and Happy New Year. Thank you so much to all of you who donated in our Christmas and New Year donation drive. It really is thanks to the generosity of viewers and listeners like yourself that Spiked is able to keep going from strength to strength. If you haven't given a donation yet and you'd like to, it's really easy to do. Just go to spiked-online.com/donate to set up your regular donation today. That's spikes-online.com/donate. Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with me this week, as ever, for the first episode of 2022, we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist, Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on the show, Novak Djokovic's detainment in Australia, the anniversary of the Capitol riot, big tech censorship, and the toppling of the Edward Colston statue. So, the world's number one tennis player, Novak Djokovic, is currently detained in Australia. His visa has been revoked in advance of the Australian Open. And this is to do with the fact that Australia has some pretty stringent controls on who can come in, and especially in relation to the COVID vaccine. Tom, you've written about this week. Do you want to tell us the story?
Yeah, I think this story is quite crazy, actually. I mean, not for the first time during the pandemic, Australia just completely lost its mind, really. And I think this is another example of that. I mean, the details of this are a little bit complicated, as you say. I mean, it seems like, so to get into Australia and to play at the Australian Open, you need to have been vaccinated or have one of very few medical exemptions to it. It seems like Novak Djokovic, who is known for being anti-vax, essentially, and for not being vaccinated, and for being pretty relaxed about COVID, I think it's fair to say as well, said that he had gained the medical exemption from the relevant authorities, but in the process of him flying to Australia from Dubai, it seemed as if there was a problem with his visa. He'd applied for the wrong one. He was stopped at the border, detained, as you say, and is awaiting an appeal in a kind of immigration hotel in a slightly down at heel part of Melbourne. And the political explosion around it, I think, is really, really interesting. So Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, has been incredibly kind of bombastic about this, I think it's fair to say. I thought it was interesting how at first he was basically just saying this is a matter for the Victorian government and for the tennis authorities, and it's up to them. But as soon as you start to get a bit more blowback, as soon as you start to see a lot of public anger and media anger about this multimillionaire tennis star being seen to, be able to get around the rules or whatever, he was suddenly saying, well, if he hasn't got the right documentation, he'll be on the first flight home, etc., etc. So it seems to have really blown up. Something that probably could have just been dealt with seems to have blown up because of the fact of the situation in Australia. They have been one of the most lockdown countries in the democratic world, certainly in Melbourne, where the Open is taking place. I think they were locked down for north of 250 days over the course of the pandemic. Some really both extreme and sometimes quite farcical restrictions that people have been suffering under there. So it seems like as a product of a lot of that kind of pent-up anger, hysteria, and an understandable sense that it might be one rule for elite sports people and one rule for everyone else, you've seen this explosion. But I just think that the demonization of him is so extreme, and it's more about that pent-up hysteria and a lot of people getting their moral rocks off, really, than it is about health or anything else in Australia, I think.
Yeah, Ella, I mean, obviously you don't want, elite tennis stars having to play by different rules, but it is just the rules are insane, aren't they?
They are. And I mean, whatever you think about Djokovic's reasoning behind, as he says, not giving information out about his vaccination status, if you look back at the kind of comments that he's made about vaccinations, you can probably come to your own conclusions about what his status might be. And you might, as we do, disagree with that because we think vaccination is a good thing, particularly in times of a pandemic. But the response by the Australian government isn't about Djokovic being this kind of innate threat, this virus carrier. It's not about public health. Look at one of the statements made by Barnaby Joyce, the Deputy Prime Minister, to just kind of highlight the hysteria of what's going on and also the mundanity of what's going on. He said, if Djokovic has filled out the wrong papers, he is something like, I'm paraphrasing, threatening Australian sovereignty. If you filled out the wrong forms, I mean, this is like usually there's like a bit of admin that one of the people in the background that these huge events like the Australian Open is, you filled out the wrong form, just, fast track it. But obviously that couldn't have happened because he's become not just this one individual trying to enter a country, but a symbol for Australia to kind of moral grandstand about what they're doing. It's also been disappointing to see, though there are lots of people outside his hotel, particularly Serbians, supporting him and saying that this is terrible. It was disappointing to see so many Australians come out and say, well, yes, because we have been under such severe restrictions, you should too. There's a kind of a race to the bottom. This is all in the context of, the Australian government having put their citizens through a really miserable Christmas, not just because of restrictions, but also recently removing some of the provisions for free PCR tests, which meant that people were queuing outside test centres that they had to go to and able to go and have their Christmases and see people for, I saw some reports of 10 hours, people queuing up. So this is not let's not pretend that this is a government that is solely concerned with people's welfare and Djokovic is this threat. It's about something far more farcical, as Tom says, and mundane and therefore wrong.
It seems the other thing that seems to be going on in the background here is this war on the unvaccinated that has taken hold in much of the Western world, where people who, as we say, we think it's wrong not to get vaccinated, but the way people are being singled out and demonized. Emmanuel Macron, president of France, recently this week said his intention is to piss off the unvaccinated. We have mandatory vaccinations coming in Italy for the over 50s. We've spoken about Austria before on this podcast. Now we know that they're going to be fining unvaccinated residents, I think, around €4,000 nearly every few months. I mean, Tom, what do you make of this turn in COVID policy at the moment?
Well, I think it's just becoming increasingly kind of vengeful and unhinged, to be perfectly honest with you. And I think Djokovic is a stand-in, a sort of figurehead, a punching bag for a lot of that pent-up anger and demonisation, really, which has been sent unvaccinated people's way. Now, don't get me wrong, especially like militant anti-vax campaigners, like I hate those people with a passion, people who go and protest outside of hospitals and disrupt testing centres and all this kind of stuff, handing out leaflets to kids outside of schools, pushing complete nonsense. I mean, these people are condemnable, but at the same time, you do have to ask the question of where is this kind of animus coming from, particularly at this point in the pandemic, when we do have that level of vaccine protection in a lot of places, not all, it's fair to say, but in a lot of places, and yet it still seems to kind of ratchet up all the time. I mean, Australia, it's north of 90% of people over the age of 16 have been jabbed twice at least. I mean, their booster campaign doesn't seem to be going great guns at the moment, but nevertheless, it's still pretty solid. And yet this anger seems to continue over what is essentially, in many cases, for some people, particularly in highly vaccinated nations, just a probably quite ill-advised personal choice for them and their families and the people close to them, if you see what I mean. It's nothing more significant than that. And yet you still have all of this animus. And, in a figure like Novak Djokovic, his views on vaccination are well known, but he's got all kinds of very strange views about things. I mean, there's a clip of him doing the rounds talking about how he believes that positive human emotions can purify water, things like this. There's a lot of weird new age stuff going on there, but we don't turn to our sports people for moral, let alone medical advice. It just seems to me that he's just become a stand-in for all of that pent-up anger, that kind of demonization, which again seems to be completely decoupled from what is actually important for the broader community, if you see what I mean, and just more about, it's just a kind of moral condemnation. It's people getting off on beating up on these people rather than anything else at this point.
Ella?
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to be cruel or to be blunt, more accurately, you'd say that then part of the problem why the anti-vax position is so frustrating is that by and large it's kind of anti-science. It ranges from the really kooky to kind of some kind of hippie thing of I don't want to put stuff in my body, and it annoys me as much as the kind of people who talk about chakras and won't take paracetamol because their body's a temple and all that kind of thing. But then the position of particularly governments in Europe, and particularly, I say every time his name gets brought up on this podcast, Emmanuel Macron, who is Mr. Anti-Vax. Remember what he did about AstraZeneca.
Saying it's quasi-ineffective in the elderly.
Yeah, so no wonder some of his citizens aren't too keen on taking it up. But the position of these governments is also anti-science because it's not simply about a medical question. This is quite obviously political grandstanding. There is quite clearly across Europe now a rather dark race to who can be the more coercive, who can be shown to be more serious about implementing regulations, and citizens are suffering at the hands of it because the bottom line is anyone who isn't vaccinated at this point, particularly in places like Australia or the UK where vaccination take-up has been really high, are the people who need very sensitive and reasonable and kind of collegiate discussion, the people who you need to kind of try and bring on side, not the people who you want to drive further into either their conspiracy theories or just their fears and their worries and their reasonable anxieties. And all these kind of coercive measures is just going to do the opposite. So if you want a real problem with strains taking over, you want a real problem with the bad side of people not having vaccinations, keep pushing these measures.
Absolutely. So let's turn to America now. On the day we're recording this, it's the anniversary of the Capitol riot, the 6th of January. Joe Biden has laid the blame squarely at the feet of President Trump, saying he was spreading a web of lies. I mean, we look back to that day, we all remember the scenes of, a mob breaking into the Capitol, this kind of sacred place of American democracy, breaking into the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office. A lot of milling around in confusion, someone stealing a podium. There was a sort of silly side to it as well. And I think around 700 people have been arrested since then in connection to it. But as serious as the event was, there has been a lot of myths that have spread around it and some inflation. I mean, Tom, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, because you're right. I mean, for Joe Biden talking about so much misinformation and whatnot, laying at the feet of Donald Trump, not without cause, the distortion of what happened on January 6th last year is so striking. I mean, first of all, just the way in which it's talked about, it is being labelled completely explicitly as a coup, as an insurrection in the American liberal media. This was a 3-hour-long riot. It was violent. It was ugly. Some people died in the course of that, which is very, very tragic. And it wasn't anything to necessarily celebrate. I mean, a lot of the people there were genuinely convinced of a lot of nonsense about the election being stolen. They wanted to overturn it. None of that is positive, but it wasn't some organised coup attempt. It wasn't an insurrection. I mean, the idea that all of these people could somehow overthrow the most powerful military power in the world. I mean, it's ridiculous when you think about it, that they would actually be able to mount something like this. So the discussion of it is very overheated. This is despite the fact that the FBI have said pretty much from the off that they don't believe it to be a kind of coup/insurrection attempt that's been coordinated by Trumpists or Trump or anyone else. It also has quite clear damaging consequences insofar as this whole narrative that this was basically on par with 9/11, Pearl Harbor, which people have said explicitly. It invites an authoritarian response, and all of the discussion that we've seen in the past year over basically Trumpists being treated as a domestic terror threat, that they need to be treated as basically akin to ISIS, has very alarming potential consequences for civil liberties, obviously. But as you say, just on the question of all the facts and whatnot, I mean, there's just so much lies which still manage to exist about this particular incident. So first of all, it's worth pointing out that I think 5 people died in the course of that day and the kind of aftermath of it. 4 of them were Trump supporters. Only one of those people in total was actually killed, and that was a Trump supporter who was shot at point-blank range, unarmed by police. A few of the others had heart attacks and things like this. There was a police officer who died as a result of 2 strokes. I think that's right, saying Brian Sicknick. In the aftermath of that, you had the New York Times pushing a completely uncorroborated and it turns out untrue story that he was bludgeoned to death by a fire extinguisher, when it turns out that he did eventually die of natural causes. You could see how that was contributed to by the stress and the melee and all the rest of it, but still. But again, these myths kind of linger on, the idea that loads of people were armed. People weren't armed inside the Capitol building. All of this, I think, has just not really been challenged. And it's just become this kind of founding myth of this kind of newly reinstated in power liberal establishment. And it's only, I think, going to kind of feed a sense of mutual suspicion and fear completely unnecessarily, because it was a bad thing that happened. It shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have been. They shouldn't be allowed to get anywhere near the Capitol building. But at the same time, it wasn't a coup. It wasn't an insurrection. And the willingness of people to continue propagating that nonsense, I think, is quite alarming, frankly.
The thing about the lie about the police officer Brian Sicknick is really interesting because Glenn Greenwald points this out. If you think about what was happening that day and that evening, a place where loads of people were live streaming it. There were phones all over the place. He points out the fact that the Capitol building is like one of the most surveilled places in America. There's CCTV everywhere. But that somehow, all that access to all that information and that evidence, even in the scrum of what was a 3-hour riot, didn't stop really reputable or supposedly reputable publications like the New York Times, Twitter pages that were kind of reporting news from just basically pushing this, what turned out to be this lie about him being violent, Brian being violently bludgeoned to death with a fire extinguisher. And the reason why it's interesting is because that there in play is basically it's not a conspiracy theory, but it's the kind of the groundwork for how a conspiracy theory is laid. You have a desire to see a kind of truth. You have this sort of kind of salivating among some members of the US liberal press, needing to see these really ridiculous Trump supporters, lots of them, the Q shaman in his horns and his furs, kind of some of them shouting for Jesus, some of them shouting about pedophiles. It's odd for people in Britain to watch it. Maybe it's more normal in America, but and they needed to see them as a menace, as a threat to democracy. Whereas, as Tom says, there was certainly some undemocratic points that were to be made there, but they weren't this kind of inflamed army hell-bent on a coup. And that's exactly what happens with a lot of those Trump protesters in relation to their desire to go along with these crazy kind of QAnon conspiracies. They hate Hillary Clinton. They hate the establishment. So then they develop this kind of desire to see everything as a satanic plot to, protect pedophiles. And it's that kind of, no one is stepping back and saying, hang on a minute, there are some similarities here. You've all lost the plot. Why isn't anyone taking a reasonable step? And there was a really interesting podcast that the BBC has just released called The Coming Storm, with Gabriel Gatehouse presenting it, that starts off really interestingly looking at how the kind of beginnings of QAnon in 1993 in relation to the Clintons. But at no point, and this is classic because it's the BBC, at no point does it point out that some of that QAnon, the responsibility for what happened on January the 6th and the kind of fever that was in the air wasn't just about Trump. It was also about what's happened in American politics for the last 6, 7, 10, 20 years.
Yeah.
About the anti-establishment feeling that isn't crazy, that is genuine. And there was no kind of, does Joe Biden or any of these people not feel a little bit of blame themselves for calling into question election results, themselves talking about conspiracy theories relating to Russia? So it leaves you with a real sour taste in your mouth.
No, I think the point about double standards is really, really important, because in so many ways, the Democrats and the kind of Democratic establishment are a mirror image of what they're accusing the Trumpers of being. I mean, you talk about, not recognizing the election. Hillary Clinton has never properly, she conceded formally, but she's always maintained that basically it was stolen off of her by the Russians. She urged Joe Biden not to concede in the wake of the 2020 election. And seeing Kamala Harris today talking about how this was an attack on our democracy, we saw how fragile it was. You also raised an interesting question for me, because you talked about, one of the pillars of this is free and fair elections. But when we think about what happened in the run-up to the 2020 election and afterwards, this raises very difficult questions in the opposite direction, if you like. So, for instance, the fact that the Hunter Biden expose in the New York Post, which was very much billed as a thing which could knock Biden off course, these revelations about his quite debauched son's kind of wheeler-dealering in Ukraine, and how much Biden himself might have been benefiting from that and all the rest of it. This was essentially just labelled a form of nonsense, potential Russian misinformation. The Post were kicked out of their Twitter account. They weren't able to share the story. It was also the spread of the story was suppressed on Facebook, all the rest of it. Even though in the months and weeks afterwards, it became quite clear that this story could be stood up.
Yeah.
And nevertheless, America's oldest daily newspaper, is it, locked out of its Twitter account for so long. Again, the kind of flow of information being controlled around an election in an effort to protect it, but in a way that obviously puts a thumb on the scale. You then got the question about what happens in 2024, because there's still a very high likelihood that Trump will run again. There's a very high likelihood that he could still end up being the Republican nominee. What happens you're in the context of an election in which one of the candidates is banned from all of the major social media accounts? Like, this raises very serious questions about what a free and fair election looks like in the digital world, in which when you have these tech oligarchs very willing to intervene on one side. So it's just so striking that you just have this kind of presentation of January 6th as something which really burnishes the moral authority of the Democratic establishment, shames all of these anti-democratic Trumpists, and yet the consequence of all of it for democracy were largely, I think, in the reaction to it from the elite, rather than what a bunch of idiots got up to in the Capitol building for 3 hours.
And finally, we should touch on the fact that this was a riot in a year of riots, right? We had a summer of riots after the George Floyd moment in 2020. Although we're told by the very same people saying that the Capitol riot was a terror attack, that those were mostly peaceful protests, essentially.
Yeah, that talk about double standards, the whole nature of the discussion about what is and isn't a terrorist attack, what is and isn't a riot, what's a peaceful protest, what's a kind of basically a looting episode, in America has become completely skewed, because you have so much of despite the kind of protestations among some media outlets in America talking about the fact that Trump supporters are this big threat to news journalism, that, press freedom and truth telling in journalism is under threat. You have a real infiltration of political bias, which is, it's not just Fox News doing it, it's everyone doing it, reporting what they want to see. You had these infamous scenes of a reporter stood outside kind of flaming building talking about it being peaceful protests, and a similar thing happened with the Capitol riots. Yeah. And the reason why that's a problem, and we're spiked, we don't mind a little bit of opinion and a little bit of bias or whatever in our news. People can handle it, that's what press freedom is about. But in relation to democracy, it gets to be a problem when people who want to know what's going on in the world, what's happening on that street, what's happening outside the Capitol building, and you can't trust very serious big organizations like the New York Times, or even like some of the more reporter side of the kind of Twitter pages. You don't know what's going on. That's when it becomes dangerous.
We should talk a bit about big tech censorship. You've alluded to it a little bit earlier, Tom, and the Capitol riot was something that really, pushed Facebook and Twitter to really beef up their kind of response to so-called misinformation. It's been roughly a year as well since Trump was banned, and this week we've had one of his most prominent supporters in Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, has been locked out of her Twitter account. Tom, can you tell us a little bit about the story there?
Yes, so she's been permanently suspended from her personal Twitter account. She's still got a kind of congressional official one, which she can use, for multiple breaches of Twitter's COVID misinformation policy. So it seems like there's sort of 5 strikes and you're out. It's not, as ever, it's never really clear what was the thing that did it for her. But as a lot of people have pointed out in the kind of run up to this ban, she'd been tweeting, of course, a lot about the vaccines and posting a lot of misleading kind of data from the US's kind of vaccine safety monitoring service to try and suggest that there'd basically been these kind of scores of vaccine-related deaths that no one wanted to talk about. So as a result of this, she's been kicked off. She also got a 24-hour suspension from Facebook as a result of that. And it's just how these stories almost don't shock us a year on from the Trump ban now, if you see what I mean. Now, of course, Marjorie Taylor Greene is a lunatic in all ways, shapes and forms. So not only, the kind of anti-vax conspiracy theory stuff is probably at the tamer end of the sort of stuff that she's into. Previously, she was an early pusher of the QAnon stuff, supporting all of that all of that lunacy. She had dabbled in a bit of 9/11 trutherism, suggested in a kind of online conference appearance at one point that there's no evidence that a plane hit the Pentagon.
Yeah.
Jewish space lasers, that's got to be everyone's favourite.
Classic
So a few years ago, she speculated on Facebook that wildfires in California had actually been the consequence of a space laser backed by the Rothschilds.
She's just asking questions.
She's just asking questions, exactly. The right ones, no. But so this is it goes without saying that she's not a reputable source on vaccines or anything else for that matter. But at the same time, we need to recognise how serious it is that big tech now feel incredibly comfortable. They've almost grown into this role of deciding on what is and isn't true. And what happened in 2020 in particular is the twin forces of the pandemic and Trump and the increasing kind of anti-Trump hysteria, as well as Trump becoming increasingly extreme in some respects in terms of what he was saying, basically just pushed the big tech social media firms into levels of censorship that even they didn't want to go into previously. To the point is where now what they're doing by these misinformation policies is essentially ruling on what is and isn't true. And in the same way that big tech is not qualified to do that, because no one is qualified to do that. That's the whole point. That's why you have free speech, is that everyone can make their arguments, everyone can push back, and the truth kind of emerges through all of that, and trusting people to make up their own minds. But 1 year on, this stuff is almost mundane, unfortunately. And that's something which should be the main thing that worries us, not that Marjorie Taylor Greene is, deprived of one more outlet to spread her nonsense on.
Of course. And in the UK, there's been a story around this news aggregator account called Politics for All, which has been suspended permanently with not really much clarification from Twitter as ever. I mean, the reasons given were for media manipulation and spam, but no one quite knows what the actual offending activity or tweets were. I mean, Ella, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the explanation, as far as there is one, is that, suggestion that Politics for All retweeted one of its other sub-accounts. A bit like how BBC retweets BBC Sport.
Yeah.
A bit like how, The Guardian retweets some, everyone
Guardian
does
US
it. Everyone does it. That's how Twitter works. Anyone who's a social media manager knows you've got to get the word out. And what harm does that do to people? It's utterly ridiculous. There's some kind of a lot of people are scratching their heads about Politics for All because there is just seems to be no reasonable explanation for it. It was this kind of, slightly bitchy, slightly gossipy, but interesting account. Usually, it quite often broke bits of gossip and stories that weren't elsewhere. Some of it proved to be a little bit unreliable. Some of it was quite interesting. It's your classic kind of politics, sort of slightly tabloidy politics account run by this young guy who's quite passionate about it, and by all accounts hasn't been heard from, and is probably having a really hard time at the moment. But the offshoot of this is that it's really interesting that you say a year ago, thinking about Trump, it's not become the norm. I remember when not so long ago we were all talking about how what the rights and wrongs of Alex Jones being taken off Twitter. So it's changed so rapidly. Are sort of now the blasé way in which tech giants seem to be able to just play fast and free with free speech. In fact, the UK Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, was in the House of Commons talking about disinformation and misinformation. And she sort of reassured the Labour frontbenchers saying, don't worry, our misinformation and disinformation unit is running. And it's particularly in relation to coronavirus and vaccines, it is taking content offline. And you think, hang on a minute, like, this is not okay. And this is where all the conspiracy theorists, when they talk about in America, the deep state, in the UK, when they talk about, shadowy backroom deals and what's going on and they're lying to you, it becomes very hard as a reasonable person to argue against conspiracy theory when governments and big business like big tech start doing these behind the scenes, undemocratic, unaccountable moves like tackling disinformation and misinformation, which often takes the form of someone being a bit nutty about vaccines or someone talking about, questioning data from science. And you end up in this really dangerous space, which quite like the kind of anti-vax movement, you are not convincing the people that you really need to convince about the truth. It's no wonder that you have, no wonder, and yet at the same time very surprising and sort of galling, that you have someone like Marjorie in America, a top politician, someone who's got to a really high status level in American politics, being able to engage in such crazy stuff like QAnon. And that tells you that this is a very serious issue that isn't going to be got away by legislation, but has to be about someone taking a stand for free and open debate.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's also, not to move too far away from politics because that's such a crazy situation, but on this misinformation stuff as well, you think big tech's track record with this is dreadful. I mean, it's dreadful with the question of coronavirus. I mean, the lab leak theory being the perfect example of this. In less than a year, I think, that went from being basically a racist conspiracy theory to being a pretty decent hypothesis that's worth looking into. And that's pretty much from the words of Joe Biden and Dr. Fauci. In the space of a year, I mean, if you just have a situation in which big tech, on the basis of what is just roughly considered to be the high status opinion, dismissing, silencing, censoring accounts on this basis, they're going to make all of these ridiculous mistakes. And what's so worrying about it, again, sort of casting our minds back to like when the days when it was only Alex Jones and people like that getting kicked off, Milo Yiannopoulos, etc., it being so clear that this was going to spread, was that on that question about basically judging what is true was something that Facebook and Twitter, etc., used to be very nervous about. Like, I remember when Alex Jones got kicked off of all of those accounts, I think it was like 2018 or thereabouts, they were at pains to say, Facebook and all the rest of it, this isn't about the conspiracy theories, this is about hate speech or whatever. For whatever reason, they were more comfortable with that. Putting that to one side, because Mark Zuckerberg himself said, I don't want to get into the position of deciding what is and isn't true. In an interview, he even talked about how he would even allow Holocaust denial, which got him a lot of flack necessarily because it was offensive as he found it. It was something which you can't have these companies ruling on this. And you can understand why these firms wouldn't want to get into that realm themselves. It's a lot more trouble for them. But because of all of these forces that we're talking about, particularly in 2020, and their own cowardice in large part, they've willingly taken up that mantle. it seems inconceivable that they're going to go back from this at this point.
So finally, let's talk about the Colston Four. Cast your minds back to the summer of 2020, and in Bristol, the statue of Edward Colston was pulled down and dumped in the River Avon. The four of the people involved have had their day in court, and they've been cleared of criminal damage, even though they admitted to toppling the statue. Ella, what have you made of this quite surprising judgment?
Well, I mean, I don't want to slag off the judgment too strongly, because it was a jury decision, and we very much in these days of everyone being undemocratic around how people can be involved in the process of justice. I support juries and I support the jury decision. However, it does make you
what a blunder.
It does make you laugh. Laugh or cry, but the sort of infantile nature of the way in which this has been discussed. You have these four individuals, they're young activists, go-getters, standing on the
Sage
court
Willoughby,
steps.
Milo Ponsford, straight out of Central Casting.
Crying as well, some of them, and opining as if they are these kind of modern day saviors. There's something a little bit Rachel Dolezal about some of it. There's something, there is just something very uncomfortable about watching these four individuals claiming that they are, that this was an act of love, not an act of hate, that the offensiveness of the Colston statue was such that they were doing a good to society. And there's just a completely infantile way of looking at what criminal damage is. I mean, every adult knows that if there's a racist poster in that window and I take it upon myself to kick the window in because racism is awful, you don't expect then the police to go, oh, well done. You've broken a window, you've toppled a statue. There's a basic level of, I'm not a big fan of locking people up for criminal damage. I don't put a lot of stock by statues, these slow ones of Colston, but there are some basic rules here. But there's also a real kind of, the more sinister end of it is the fact that they use this kind of excuse of offensiveness to win their case. That it was a hate crime, that the very presence of this inanimate object was such that they had to take the law into their own hands, because otherwise it would have been offending the people of Bristol. I mean, that's the thing that is not so much funny anymore, that is really the problem, because if it was, that's where the political bias comes in. If it was any other kind of political motive, say if it was a load of right-wingers kicking over a statue of, I don't know, Mother Teresa or the Dalai, someone else, everyone would be up in
Mandela statue.
Everyone would be up in arms. Brendan O'Neill makes the point about this. But because there's this political motive about it, because even the police themselves are too afraid to say, hang on a minute, you shouldn't be doing this, because they're like, whoa, we don't like slavery.
Yeah.
Then you think, where are the rules? We can make an argument about the rules being changed, but if there are rules, they need to be adhered to.
Adil Ray from Good Morning Britain has compared the Colston Four to the suffragettes, to civil rights heroes,
anti-apartheid struggle,
the anti-apartheid struggle. I mean, that seems all the more funny when you consider some of the statues that people wanted to take down after the Colston one, as well as evil slave traders, of course, people wanted to take down. There was the Winston Churchill statue, the statue of Robert Baden-Powell, the founder of the Scouts, somehow got caught up in the statue wars. The statue of Gandhi in Leicester, people had to go around and protect in case, anti-racist activists took it down. I mean, this was an absurd period in our history, Tom, wasn't it?
I mean, didn't Keith Vaz stand guard around the Gandhi
Keith Vaz organised the protection of the Gandhi statue.
I'll leave that one there. But it again indicates that it was a crazy, crazy time. But at the end of the day, you're talking about inanimate objects. It's an important thing to stress. Now, in Bristol, for a very long time, there has been this discussion about what to do about Colston. It's not just the statue. Various buildings, streets, pubs, all sorts of things are named after him. And there's been a kind of small movement of kind of, amateur historians who've been making the point that really kind of venerating him to this degree. And there was still an element of veneration, certain kind of rituals that would be engaged in on occasion and all the rest of it, because of the fact that after committing all the horrendous crimes he did, he tries to kind of clean up his image by funding some almshouses and all the rest of it. But nevertheless, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about a statue that probably, I would wager, the vast majority of people just walk by each day without really thinking about it. And yet, this is being presented as like the great anti-racist struggle of our age. It's unhinged, really. I mean, it was just born out of that whole kind of wake of the Black Lives Matter kind of moment, which just became really about finding anything to rage against. I mean, it quickly became a discussion about a police shooting in America to toppling statues in Bristol. I mean, this is just utterly ridiculous. And as we've been talking about, it just raises now this kind of serious question as to, is it okay to smash stuff up if you've got high status opinions? Is that basically what we're saying now? Now, it was a jury ruling, this doesn't set legal precedent, but the kind of moral precedent that it sets is worth looking at. There's this ongoing discussion in Bristol as well about why the police didn't do more, for instance, something that a lot of people get quite agitated about. And the local police chief there has essentially said the quiet part out loud, insofar as saying, how would it look if we were trying to get between people trying to smash up a statue of a slave trader? And what messages would people take from that? But again, it just shows that even in the kind of question of police practice, all of these questions and biases kind of slip in. And whilst the James O'Briens of this world are trying to push this line that how you feel about that statue is how you feel about slavery, it's just bullshit, midwit, perspective on these things. Again, that's not what's going on here. This isn't a straightforward argument between being racist and anti-racist, pro-slavery, anti-slavery. The vast majority of people are on the same page about that. It's the question about who gets to decide what monuments are there? How do you topple them? Shouldn't it be a decision for, say, the people of Bristol rather than just a bunch of people from Bristol and Hampshire and a few other places, getting a bit overexcited one day? And also, isn't this just a bit nuts?
Yeah.
That's the other dimension to this. So feels like it sets a bit of an alarming kind of moral precedent as to where we are as much as anything else. And also just that, for whatever reason, images and shadows and pictures seem to matter so much to these people rather than the actual issues that would affect people in Bristol or anywhere else.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.